We're going to talk today about SAT versus ACT, some differences, some similarities, and then timelines as well as college expectations. My name is Tal Kitron. I work with Applerouth and I've been with the company for about 10 years now. Began as a tutor and teacher, worked in various capacities, and now I'm back to being full-time online premium tutor, specializing in SAT, ACT, and the occasional PSAT prep. Please feel free as we go to put questions in the Q&A function. I'll try to get to them at the end, assuming we've got time. And if you have any other technical questions, just throw them in there and our moderator will help you out. We're going to start with testing's role in admissions, which has changed over the years. I think it's important to, just for students and families alike, to understand that test scores do not define us. They're an important piece of the admissions process, and it's definitely a factor that will influence an admissions decision. But you can see it's secondary or even tertiary to grades and academic rigor, your strength of schedule. And there are other things like personal statements and recommendations and class rank that factor in. So test scores are just a part of the application and admissions portfolio, not everything, but a big part of it. Getting into the differences between the two tests, number one is that SAT is a more rigorous reading test. We're going to talk more about that, but it's the first section on the SAT versus third on ACT. So you start right off with reading, and the SAT is just quite a bit more advanced in terms of passage material, passage type, and questions themselves. A lot of critical thinking and analysis involved. The ACT is more of a matching game on all sections, including reading. As opposed to the SAT, the ACT is much more rigorous when it comes to STEM. It does have a science section, although that's not technically science. It is really more about data analysis and interpretation, so reading tables and graphs. In the math section of the ACT, it wants you to know a little bit about a lot. So whereas we'll talk more about this, the SAT focuses in on a few things. The ACT will test anything from arithmetic to calculus to trig to stats. All that being said, there's a lot of overlap, about 80% overlap in content. So many of the differences are just about test taking strategy and little nuances. Both tests certainly will test your reading and English and grammar skills, along with rhetoric. Graph reading and interpretation comes up on the SAT on reading and writing sections, interestingly. And of course, on section 4, science at ACT. And then both will test some algebra, some statistics, basic mean, median, mode, and some geometry. That being said, the ACT is heavy on geometry and doesn't give you formulas. The SAT does give you formulas and rarely tests it. We've mentioned that SAT's got more advanced reading, so on math, there's more word problems, versus the ACT has a little bit more advanced science, not super advanced, basic scientific outside knowledge, and then some more advanced math when you get to the end of the test. Very similar structure for now. The SAT is changing, and we'll speak about that. You can take a look here at the breakdown. You can see the SAT is actually in the correct order, where you've got reading and then writing, and then it's actually no calculator math and then calculator math. So 2 math sections to end, versus the ACT that goes actually English, math, and then reading science, and is slightly shorter, although there are more questions throughout. Both tests have what's called an experimental section, where if a tutor doesn't remind a student that they have it, it's section 5, so they'll get panicked a little bit sometimes. Section 5 is not real, it's not actually graded, it's for future data for future tests. And so most students will take a section 5 that won't matter, doesn't affect the overall score. SAT did away with the essay recently. The ACT still has an optional one, but it is very much optional. Biggest difference, I think, as far as choosing which tests and just the overarching differences is that ACT is a test of speed. The SAT is less so. Does that mean that nobody will run out of time on the SAT? No. Some people still have time issues. But if you look at how much time you get per question, it's just a kind of a vast difference. You can see it's almost a 30 or 40% increase in how much time you get per question on SAT. And that adds up, that can be significant. That being said, if someone has extended time accommodations, that may mean take the ACT because it's such an advantage to have a little bit more time. I do find that a lot of students prefer SAT just because it is more forgiving on timing, but it really varies. Some people take both tests and really prefer ACT. We'll talk a little bit more about how to choose a test today. So we've touched on the SAT's common core skills, a lot of algebra, and the ACT expands into much harder content, not needing you to know everything about it, but just, hey, have you ever heard of a logarithm? Here's a point. ACT will say, what's a matrix? Do you know that? Here's another point. Versus the SAT will have you solving quadratics and all this stuff. On the SAT, interpretation over solving. So there's usually a simple method, but if you don't know what you're solving for, we'll see people run into trouble. The SAT is more of an applied math test, meaning a lot of times you'll see similar concepts and topics tested in different ways. A lot of overlapping content. So using skills like isolating, distributing, substituting, factoring, FOILing, all the basic math that people have done forever. It's just rusty oftentimes because basic algebra, algebra 1, sometimes is a year or two before people take these tests. And on the math, as it is with the reading, it's more reading intensive. So ACT has its fair share of word problems, but they're simpler and it doesn't hide the ball. The SAT sometimes will be a little bit tricky. ACT, on the other hand, more straightforward, heuristics, rule-based, concepts in isolation, meaning, again, here's an absolute value question. Do you know what this is? And they'll give you a point if you know it. So it's really just about kind of surface level understanding of a lot of topics. Whereas on the SAT, you don't always get a calculator. ACT, you do. And the ACT, like we said, pulls from just a broader range. The other thing that's not on here is that the SAT has some free response questions. So a few on each section, no calc and calculator. Those that have no multiple choice answers, you're going to grid in. And then also on the SAT, well, actually on both of them, you can use a calculator, but on SAT, you've got that one no calculator section, section 3. This is a good breakdown of what's tested. It changes test to test, but not a huge amount. So this is averaging out a bunch of different ACTs and SATs. What you can see is ACT is way heavier on geometry. So that'll be a big focus for ACT prep. Whereas SAT is huge on algebra. 62% of the questions are algebra. That's a lot. I mean, that's the vast majority. And then stats and data analysis makes up another big chunk for SAT. A lot of times with SAT, those questions will catch people by surprise, but once they have a very brief kind of introductory session for that stuff, mean, median, mode, standard deviation, you can usually get what the SAT is asking for. On both tests, I think trig is mostly an afterthought, but there's more SOHCAHTOA on ACT, and radians and unit circle stuff. So if that scares you, you may lean towards SAT, and again, more algebra. Digging in a little bit more to ACT math, you can see a lot of different things. Some of these you can actually do on the calculator. So as a tutor, I'll be teaching people, well, here, if you press alpha on your calculator, you can get to, or second x to the -1, you can get to matrices, and you can actually enter a matrix and multiply it together. I try not to have people memorize too much because, especially during the school year, we've got so much information packed into our brain. These tests, you don't want to have to try to study like a normal test and cram and memorize. It doesn't work. So the few things you do have to memorize if you're going to reach for a really high ACT math score would be hyperbolas, ellipses, just shapes and formulas that maybe you haven't done or aren't stuck in most people's heads. Other things could include understanding domain or range of a function, which I haven't seen them test horizontal asymptotes much, mostly vertical. They usually do the easier one, but that would often for people be like, I remember I learned this once, and now I got to go figure out how. Trig we talked about with degree measures, radians, and SOHCAHTOA stuff. And then the last two are actually just terminology, like just understanding what those are, which are a lot simpler than people think. Monomial meaning just one term, not two. And then these properties are about like when you add or multiply and change things around. So it's something that people probably learn in elementary school, if at all. But the ACT will test it out of the blue on like question 34, and then 35 will be back to algebra. So these are just some examples of things that have been on recent ACTs on the math sections. Let's get into some of the logistics as well, which we'll sprinkle in as we go. So which test to try first? I mean, both, ideally. I'm starting with a lot of students this summer, and the first move, if possible, is take a mock SAT and a mock ACT. And you start with your strength. I mean, if there's a very obvious one, we'll go with that test. If not, and often the scores are comparable, I'm big on we're going to do better at what we like. So whichever test felt better, and usually students will feel one way about a test, over the other. So we'll do that, right? We'll schedule for that. I will say that if it's a really close call, you got to bring into consideration schedule and extracurriculars and just which test dates are we preparing for, which we're also going to look at in a moment. It is very important and wise to focus on one test, so not to look at ACT and SAT both. So you start out taking mock tests and decide on one. Rarely, you might need to switch. So let's say we decided on the wrong test, it's just not working, we hit a wall on SAT. Then we can switch to ACT, and sometimes people just like the different look. I will say it's rare that we want to switch tests, and it's only if we're really hitting a wall and just not liking it, we want to try something new. Although I just mentioned schedules, I think under most circumstances, you should first figure out which tests and then try to mold your schedule around the official tests. Everyone takes the PSAT on a Wednesday in October for most people. And so it's important to either look at that score or take a mock SAT, which is a bit better. But you compare your performance on PSAT or SAT versus the ACT. And Applerouth has an easy tool on the website. You can enter in a score and it'll show you what that was on SAT. If there's like a 70-point difference for SAT over ACT, go with that. If it's under 60 points, and I'd say maybe under 50, then it's really a matter of preference. It's a matter of looking at a couple little things like timing. So I would say if it's a close call, I would ask the student, did you feel rushed on time? Did you hate that? For reading, do you feel like going more quickly with basic stuff fits your skills? Or would you rather slow down and be analytical and work on that? And so if it's a close call, then there's other things you got to just talk through. But usually we just go with what you like. That's what we'll do best with. I say that as a recovering lawyer, and I did not enjoy that, but now working in an education company for 10 years, that I like, and we will do better with what we're good at. That being said, if possible, you should probably plan to take this test at least twice, if not 3 times. Most of my students over the years need 3 tests. I mean, almost everyone needs 2. And it just takes most 3 tests to reach full potential. The one and done, even for super high scores, is rare and maybe not desirable because it puts a lot of pressure, right? So if I'm thinking I got to get this near perfect score on this one test, it doesn't work out that way very often because people are just stressed out. But if I know I've got another one in 2 months and I've got another one after that, then you can treat the first one as a practice run. And sometimes that's the score that really comes through because there's less pressure and we know we've got more cracks at it. There are some myths about the SAT. So one is that certain months are better to take the tests in because of the curve, because this test is greater than the curve. We just haven't seen any evidence of that. There aren't like people flying in to take certain tests, and we haven't really seen any major patterns. So that really just goes back to take the official test and register based on your schedule and your timeline. Don't worry about taking November. What's honestly important is for SAT, the 3 tests that are really good to look out for would be the October one, the March one, and the May one. Because each year, those are the 3 tests where you can get the full report back. So 10 days after the 10 to 14 days after the test, I can actually go online to sat.org first if a student has an account, which you would if you took this test, and we can work through every question that they missed. So it gives a full online version of the test, like 10, 14 days after when scores come back. So that's a tremendous resource. And a lot of times as people are prepping for SAT, March and May are good ones to start with because you can get March back and use that first test to prepare for the second one. Tremendous resource. A lot of elements to successful test prep. So mock tests are important to start, but then also throughout to measure progress. I think one is just being in the testing center and getting that experience. That's huge for students. And then realizing what the time constraints feel like and making mistakes, it's important. You want to have practice that's distributed. So this is not a test you can cram for. So it's all about organization, structure, schedule. And then we want to start early. So that's different for different people. But some high scoring rising juniors are starting this summer because they're preparing for PSAT in October and SAT also in October. So making sure that you're just giving yourself enough time so you got plenty of cracks at the tests. Another element will be how much time do you spend on tasks, both in session and out. Finish strong. So a big thing that I'm always harping on is confidence and momentum. Really need to always build backwards from a test so that you're leading into it with weekly sessions and kind of finishing strong. Some people like having a session the day before the test. Some people really don't. They want to rest that day. So it's all about just what's going to make you feel best. And then setting a goal. So it's a very hard question when I get what's a good score, because it just varies. It depends on where you're starting and what your goals are. I do think that taking a baseline test and prepping and taking another one is a really good way to set a goal, because after that second test, you can see where you're improving and get a sense of your ceiling a bit better. So I always like setting goals super high. And then if we don't achieve them, at least we're having a big improvement and can feel great about that. All right, so the rest of the we're going to talk about this highly simplified testing plan, because there's no real way in an hour's time to go over all of it. But my hope is that this will give you guys some important and useful information. Maybe it'll spark some questions for me or college counselors, and just kind of get you thinking about how we want to do this. Here's the schedules. Here are the schedules for tests every year. What you can see is that the first one each year is in February, the ACT. The SAT doesn't have one in January or February, which is kind of a big gap. Things to consider. I mean, the ACT and SAT in December is usually right before finals and sometimes coincides with AP exams for the fall. That can be a tough date. Same with May and June for SAT, but oftentimes people are taking those because they don't have that many AP exams, or this is just the right time for it. So it really is multi-factored as far as how to decide which test to take. What I'm really fond of is the back-to-back dates. So like September, October ACT are usually great ones. Or June, July ACT, or May and June SAT, or like this October, November, December range for SAT and PSAT is also really nice. As you can see there, the stars have the dates that you can get the whole test back: October, March, and May for SAT, and for ACT, it's April, June, December. So you can get those, but it's not online. So if you took the April ACT and got the test information release, it actually would only come back like barely before the June ACT. Still useful, but not quite as friendly or efficient. So what about the SAT? There have been some changes. There continue to be changes in the SAT. Last year, they did away with SAT subject tests, which is great. I mean, it's just another thing adding to AP exams. Those were tests that you could take for college credit, and it was just another thing in the growing fracas of applicants doing everything they can and more to boost their portfolio. So subject tests are gone, and the essay is also gone. No more writing portion. Personal statements are going to be more important. The big change is coming in a couple of years, and it will affect current freshmen, not sophomores, juniors, seniors. They're shortening the test. So it's now about 3 hours. It's going to be down to 2. More time per question. SAT is already friendlier with time, but now even more so. So it's not a speed test, which is good. The reading passages are shorter, sometimes only 1 question per passage. And we'll cover, quote, a wider range of topics, which remains to be seen what that means. You can get a calculator, so no calc section, which people like. And most calculators are legal. So TI-84, most TI Inspires, as long as it's not a computer, it's legal. And the top score in SAT will still be 1,600. So the ones they did it 2,400 for a few years, 10 years ago, but we're sticking with the 800 math, 800 verbal. Because it's going to be in computer labs and digitally, and just generally the way they're changing it, schools are going to have more flexibility to schedule the tests. So probably you'll see more in-school testing and just dates where all students are either required to or offered the opportunity to take a test, which is great. If you can do it like on a Wednesday in school in an environment that you're comfortable with, familiar with, you don't have to register or pay, that's a great opportunity. What's really nice is if there's an in-school test like in April and the official test on a Saturday, I've had students do really well when they take both, because then they're taking them like within a week or two of each other and really understanding, here's what I need to hone in on for this next test, the second one. As far as changes with the ACT, what's happening? Well, there's been word on the street for a long time about they're moving to computer-based testing. And internationally, all my students overseas had been on a computer for ACT for years, a few years now. All international ACTs are on a computer, but domestically, they're pretty much all still pencil and paper. The other thing that was promised that's really great if it happens is you're going to be able to take just one section. So instead of taking the whole ACT, you can take just the math. Or like if I didn't do as well in science, I can just do science. We're going to talk about super scoring. And I mean, I can't say enough how big of a boon that would be to students if and when they do implement this. But they've been promising it for a while and it hasn't happened yet. So it'll happen all pretty quickly, even maybe next year, or I would guess the year after. So I mentioned super scoring. ACT and SAT have both done super scoring for a while. And what that means is that from multiple test sittings, some colleges will take the super score, which means only the highest section scores from across multiple sittings. And now what the ACT does is it actually automatically super scores. So when sending score reports to colleges, which you can sometimes do for free on the website for the test before you register, but more often people wait to get their scores back, and then down the road you spend the 10, 15 bucks to submit a test as part of an application. The ACT now has the option to submit individual tests or just submit your super score. So for the colleges that do consider super scores, which again is over half, you can just automatically send your super score, only have to send one test. That makes it pretty easy. So we just try to simplify it a bit for people. And of course, they're trying to make the ACT more appealing. Something that's kind of swept the world in the past few years is the test optional tsunami, which I thought would have a much bigger impact on my tutoring load and just testing life in general than it has. But I think there's a lot to flesh out here. Policies are generally broken down into these categories. Some colleges require tests, some are test optional, some are test flexible, and some are test blind. The test required is slowly coming back. So after, as the pandemic maybe dies down, or we return to some level of normalcy, it seems like Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, not yet, but Florida and Georgia are major schools are coming back to requiring SAT or ACT for admissions. There are no colleges that prefer SAT over ACT or vice versa. So that is not a factor in deciding which test. But it is interesting when you're applying to schools this day and age, what test optional really means and what it doesn't mean. These are two other colleges that test required has come back, and there's rumors of more highly selective schools that are going to join. So a couple of years, they were test optional. You did not have to submit an SAT or ACT, and they got a lot more applicants because of it. But they're going back to now, these two schools are going back to requiring tests as part of your application. So I think this is really the interesting one. Test optional means exactly what it sounds like. But I will say that most of my students who are applying to test optional schools, because there are so many of them and so many new applicants, are pursuing test prep and are submitting their tests as long as they are happy with them. We're going to talk a bit about what scores to submit and maybe what not. So if it's test optional, the college is going to get some applications with scores and some without, so different piles. The ones with test scores, they're going to look at the test scores as part of the decision. So you would only include them if you think that it boosts your portfolio, makes you a more attractive candidate. And most colleges and universities are test optional right now since the beginning of the pandemic. Oh, I just want one more thing. It's good usually when you're applying to schools, and again, this is a college counselor question more, but you can actually prepare the entire application, answer the short answers, and fill out everything, and FAFSA and personal statements, and submit it. And then you can supplement it with scores very, very easily by sending them to a school. And colleges will just add that straight onto your application. So even if you're feeling like you're stalling out over the summer, but you need to get moving on college apps, you can just do that and then add or not add a score as the case may be down the road. 1,820 plus schools are test optional for this cycle, which is more than 3/4 of all US colleges and universities, which is way up from about 1,000 prior to the pandemic a few years ago. And this is especially among some of the most elite and selective schools. I think we could argue we're returning to some semblance of normalcy, and test optional is still dominant. There will be some changes, but I think that it's safe to say that for now and for the next couple of years at least, test optional will probably be what we will see more than other positions. Right now, as far as the Common App schools, which is a good chunk of schools where you can just apply to by only filling out the Common App, it's been around forever. Only 5% of schools require testing. So you can see that Georgetown and then all those Georgia schools and a couple of Florida ones, but vast majority do not test optional. There's some data here that's maybe now a tiny bit dated. The estimate was within 3 to 5 years, 20 to 30% of schools would require testing. That now seems a little bit high. 60 to 70% would be test optional. So maybe that'll be more like 70, 80%. And 5 to 10% are test blind, which means you can't even submit a test at all. They won't look, they just don't consider testing one bit. Because everything is not back to normal, most colleges, many of them are just kind of holding the line as we're test optional right now. We want to figure out how this impacts admissions and diversity and the student body in general, and just want to see how it goes. So that'll be, we've already seen some results, and that will come in over the next year or so. They've seen a lot more applications because of this, and more of an emphasis, especially for those who don't submit scores, but really for everyone, on GPA, college courses, the high school itself. And then, I think I'm interested, and a lot of the testing administrators are interested in how will this impact people's graduation rates and readiness in general. So we're waiting for more data. A lot of colleges will defer. That's the wise move. They want to see several years before making permanent decisions, and they want to see what test submission and yearly rates look like. So they're just tracking this. We don't know, just like they don't know. Don't count on the South. So a lot of state systems have tied SAT and ACT scores to financial aid and to admissions in general. If you live in Georgia, you probably know about some of those, and we'll talk about that. But Florida actually never stopped requiring it, interestingly. In Georgia, it came back in fall 2021, and North Carolina is just restarting this year as far as tests required. So those colleges and universities, you have to submit an ACT or SAT. And then Rick Clark at Georgia Tech has advised that other state systems in the South probably will do the same. And so it tends to generally spread pretty quickly. Look out for that in the next however many months or years. A lot of colleges are going to follow Harvard's lead, it seems like, where for the next several years up to 2026 application cycle, Harvard's going to stay test optional, and they're going to get this full graduating class who started in 2023 and then will graduate in 2006, and look for performance among those who did submit official scores and those who didn't. So there's this pile of students who are admitted in the test optional pile with no scores. There's other subsection of near perfect Harvard-y high test scores. And they're just going to compare. It'll be really interesting to see, like, what was their achievement like? Was it very different? Did the test scores, high test scores, high achievers do better or more poorly? I'm not sure. So that'll be interesting to look out for as well. Supreme Court in the news a lot recently. The ruling on affirmative action, which was a while back, may eliminate testing requirements. So that's going to be interesting to watch. There's a Harvard UNC case, and that might end up as like we can't require tests anymore because it violates certain provisions of the Constitution. If colleges can't factor in race or ethnicity, then the requiring test scores is a lot more challenging. I mean, it's a way to standardize, right? It's graded on a curve. SAT, ACT helps admissions officers know a 3.7 at Marist might be different from a 3.7 at Westminster. And it's just one other piece that they can compare. But test scores, I think, well, I should say test optional should open up for more nuanced admissions decisions. I think it's going to be harder work to review the applications, but it does allow students, this could be problematic, it does allow students to get admitted just because the college, the admissions officers want them, right? It doesn't have to be this score boosts our portfolio and makes our college more attractive. So I just think this is all kind of nebulous stuff that's coming down the pipe. This is maybe more relevant, which is that test optional, the final summation is test optional is not test blind. In my experience and just in general, the majority of students who are admitted to these test optional schools are still submitting scores. What's different is I think counseling offices are telling students what kind of scores they should and shouldn't submit. We're going to look at that quite a bit in a moment. And of course, colleges are still going to consider results from standardized tests. It's definitely a predictor of student success because it is the only one that is graded on a curve and standardized student from one part of the world to another. It's imperfect, but still helpful. Some changes. So schools that in 2021-22 went test blind, meaning you can't submit a test even if you want to. So everyone who's being admitted has not submitted ACT or SAT to these schools on the left-hand side. And then some schools have gone permanent test blind. You can see mostly pretty small schools, but the UC system, which was developing a new test, and I think maybe abandoned that approach. That's a system of, I think, 8 schools that's very hard to get into unless you're in California, and very, very highly regarded, most of those schools. And right now, they have de-emphasized testing. They've done that for years and years, but it doesn't seem like that's been a part of a huge shift just yet. So the UC system is the biggest of those. We touched on this, but a lot of schools consider test scores in merit-based aid. So PSAT, of course, that's something that you can get a merit scholarship for if you're in the top 0.01%, but that's rare. For example, I was a national merit finalist, but I got a small scholarship from that. My SAT score and ACT scores what got me real merit-based, like 3/4 scholarships to schools. And that's what you'll still see is that the real test scores, SAT, ACT, are more likely to give big scholarship money. And we're going to run through quite a few samples. So one is, here's Alabama. Just take a look at the scholarships, tuition numbers, and how much you can get from a high score. It's pretty incredible. You can see, I mean, a big difference between a 27 and a 30 or 31 on the ACT, right? It's only a few points. That's maybe 5 to 10 questions difference, which those are the types of increases you look for in test prep, and you can triple your savings per year. Very much important for merit-based scholarships still. And that's why I think part of the reason why a lot of people are at least trying the tests, at least starting out with it. A few more here. So Utah State recommends test scores for awards, and you get an automatic guaranteed scholarship if you have a 3.0 and these particular scores of 23 or 1130, which is probably 60th-ish percentile nationally. Good, but not like through the roof. Texas Tech, as a freshman, you can get a merit scholarship based on test scores, but also rank up to 9,000 per year, which is significant. And then Lake Forest College, another example where if you got a 3.0 and at least these 20 to 23 ACT scores, then you're going to get an automatic merit scholarship. So a big incentive to take those tests. I mentioned this earlier, but in Georgia, the Zell-Miller is a big one. It's actually become quite a bit more the Hope and the Zell-Miller, quite a bit more competitive and hard to get in the past 10 years. Like when I lived in Atlanta, when I first moved there, I remember it was, my wife said most people could get it, good students who had this certain GPA level. But now you need minimum composite score of 1200 or 26, not super scored, so that's in one sitting. Have to have 3.7 GPA and maintain 3.3 to remain eligible. So no, partying first semester of freshman year, get a 2.5 GPA, you could lose that scholarship. But what's interesting is these aren't scores that are like 90th percentile. These are 1226 is like 70th-ish percentile. It's great, but it's not like going to get you into a Harvard or Yale. You don't need a super competitive test score to get some pretty significant merit aid scholarships. We talked about this too, but the test optional move just popped, as in it made a lot more applicants apply to each school. So the most selective schools, the joke like for Stanford is they're trying to get down to 0% admissions, and they had more applicants than ever, because whereas a lot of times people would say, well, if I don't have a 36 or 34 or like 1500 plus on SAT, why even apply? Which 10 years ago, I mean, there's some validity to that. But now if you've got a cool story, or if you've got great extracurriculars, or if you bring something intangible to the campus that they want, maybe you could get into a Stanford without even having a test score. So lots more applicants, lots more uncertainty, because colleges always have to accept many more students than actually attend. So it's hard to decide who to offer, how many people for them to accept, because they don't know who's going to come and will they overbook, right? So that's the uncertainty, I think, was a big factor. Seen a lot more wait lists, which can be frustrating. So I will say I've seen more people come off of wait lists in the past couple of years than ever before. But so now if you apply to a school and you don't get in, but you get waitlisted, it's not a no. It's just a, we're not sure. We need to sort through all this. And then early decision replacing early action. It's early decision is you have to apply, I think, by like August or September of your senior year, of fall of senior year. And so it's really about knowing where you want to go, demonstrating that to the school. And so early decision is a way for both the applicant, but also the admissions officers to see who really wants to be there. So if you have your heart set on the school, early decision is probably more important than ever. Give you another crack at just getting in with a smaller applicant pool. Not surprisingly, with more applicants, the selective colleges got more selective. So admission rates are down across the board. You can see NYU, MIT, Duke, Emory, UGA, all considerably down because there's more people applying, but the same amount getting in. Look how much of the class percent is filled in some of these schools with early decision. I mean, this is really groundbreaking. So it's not all schools, but schools like Penn and Emory are filling 50% of their class with early decision. That's amazing. I mean, that's really compelling stuff. Duke, 54%. I mean, Barnard, Tulane, 62, 57%. So that means that when people are applying regular decision, which is more people than apply early, usually, so many fewer percentage-wise are getting in because we've already filled half the class or more. And even 30% at Virginia, I mean, that's a lot. That means we filled 30% of our class before regular decision deadlines. So that's a big change. So Cornell has clarified that they have higher scrutiny for those who don't submit a test. This is logical, but I'm glad they've clarified it. So the readers of the applications will look a little bit more closely at GPA, at extracurriculars, at what did you do to motivate yourself and stay interested with other things during school, so other learning experiences, personal statements, AP tests, recommendations. If you don't have a test score, it would make sense for it to be heightened emphasis on all this stuff. So just know that that is the case. No test score means we're looking more closely at this other stuff. It's got to be stronger. Although applicants are up, test submitters are down. So kind of a lot. I mean, 77% to 48% for Common App. So that means that in the last 2 years, we've had like a almost 30% decrease in the amount of score submission. And then in 2022, more male students submitted scores via Common App. So the trend there is that more males are going STEM, and a lot of the STEM programs will require those scores to set you apart. I don't know if I would take a whole huge amount from that. I think the biggest takeaway here is that applications are up, test scores, submissions are down some, but not very much. I've been, like I said, surprised and interested to see that it's just still very competitive. Almost everyone's still trying to test. And occasionally someone says, well, this is just not for me. But generally, if we can get a good test score, it's still extremely valuable and worth doing. Strategic submission, just meaning, should I submit or not? And so again, college counseling offices are recommending to a lot of students, well, if you don't have this certain score, don't submit to these schools, right? Unless you have this, don't even submit it. And so people can take the tests and then just make that educated decision based on a school. So a specific school might have this range. Yes, I'll submit my score. But maybe another one has a higher range. You'd rather submit it test optional. So no test. Just more data here. The bigger, more selective schools saw submission rates in like low to mid 60s for non-first gen students in 2020. And so you can just kind of see some trends here where private, it looks like whether it's a less selective or more selective school, there are many fewer non-first gen applicants. Same thing with public schools. I think this is interesting too, just getting into the more of the higher level learning. So if we take the example of one public research university, big research university with a national footprint. So just as an example, to this school, 59% submitted test scores, 59% of applicants submitted ACT or SAT, but by major, there were huge differences. So we talked about STEM, 75% of engineering applicants had test scores, 55% of business, but only 35% in education or social work, where maybe it's less important, less rigorous. So it's, yeah, STEM students just trying to show their quantitative chops via testing. Some schools only look at certain scores too, like just SAT math or just ACT science, for example. So important to look at that. Georgia Tech's a weird one for that. So, I mean, what it boils down to is, did test score submitters have an edge? Here's some breakdown of the advantage. So let me just take a look here. It definitely seems like there's an advantage to submitting tests. I feel like there's probably more to this story, so it's a bit oversimplified. But the general rule is, if you've got a test score or a shot at a pretty good test score that's within a range, you should submit it. You should try for it. It's interesting, though, that we're not seeing this data being reported now because so many colleges are in flux and trying to figure out what's the best way to handle it. So short and skinny is, yes, testing is still important and helpful. So should I try them? I mean, yeah. It's a smart move to do a baseline SAT and ACT score. We talked about this earlier before any decisions. Applerouth offers free tests, and if you're in a city with Applerouth office like Georgia or Seattle or plenty of others, you can take them in person, which is a good experience. Or you can even just do them at home online with an automated proctor. And then what the Applerouth website does is generates a full detailed report, questions you missed, questions you got right. And oftentimes in my first session with a student, that's what we're reviewing, is baseline SAT and ACT scores, deciding on the tests, and going from there. If you know you're in the range or close to the range for what your colleges are looking for, then you should probably prepare. It might play to your advantage. But if you're looking at it and you're like, man, I'm not even in the ballpark for these schools I want, but they are test optional, maybe instead you should get a summer job, start focusing on your passion of musical instrument or a sport or an internship, and don't focus on test scores if you feel like it's a high bar to reach. because it's really important. I mean, I don't need to tell you guys that junior year, even sophomore year, but junior year of high school is a really hard year. So if you can take something off your plate and it's not going to really boost your portfolio to take the test scores, then maybe you don't want to. It's an option that it wasn't there a few years ago. This we touched on too. Should I send in my test scores with my application? And some other questions we're going to address. Will they add value? Are they something that you want the admissions office to see? I mean, those are the questions you're asking when thinking about, should I send my scores along with this application? So some thoughts on that. Here we see Jeff Slingo saying that instead in business, tests are probably going to matter more. So one public university dean I talked with showed me admission rates are remarkably similar between those with and without test scores, except in STEM and business. So there's a reason that STEM and business applicants are taking tests at a higher rate, because their students with test scores got in at much higher rates. Sean Felton from Cornell says 650 or higher. 650 or higher is for just the verbal or just the math. So for an elite score like Cornell, he's saying, unless you've got like a 1300 or above, then don't submit it. And my gut instinct is maybe that's even a little bit low. Their middle range looks like it's about 1400 to 1560. So submitting a score of 1300 will fall in the bottom quartile. And you wouldn't want to submit it because it's not likely to help your portfolio. You're better off leaving the mystery of, I didn't take this test, I'm going to apply a test option. And we've talked about this a few different ways, but scores matter by major. Fine arts, classical music doesn't matter as much. So a test score below average probably wouldn't hurt. Whereas if you're doing engineering or some sort of math or whatever, then or business, then it may. Got a little bit of a formatting here issue, but what you see here is that another just piece of advice. If you've got a score in the upper 50% of the prior year's range, and data right now is a little bit unreliable just because it's skewed from the past year or two, but if it is above the 50th percentile, send it. It won't hurt you. If you're under 50%, then it's more of a consideration. So like, if you feel like it's representative of you and you want the admissions office to see it, go. But if you're thinking, man, I didn't do well, this is not me, I'm a high scoring student and this score doesn't reflect how good I am, don't send it. Right? Just go with your strengths and focus on other parts of the application. All right, getting towards the end here. Let's try to leave a few minutes for questions. So whether or not to submit depends on your GPA. I think that's just another thing to factor in. If you have otherwise stellar credentials, then average scores might not help, because then it's like, oh, maybe this person isn't the star I thought. About 2/3 of test takers do have grades that align with testing, but sometimes you see just the student who drags a bit in school but knocks the test out of the park, or vice versa. So not always. If you have test scores well below your grades, don't send them. But if you have better test scores than grades, it can be kind of a nice silver bullet of, well, my grades weren't there, but my test scores make me attractive, because colleges want to boost their own levels and their own quartiles. So if you got good test scores, it can make up for not as great grades. Individual section scores. So let's say your composite, which is adding up the English, math, reading, science, and ACT and dividing by 4 to find the average. Or for SAT, it's just adding the 2 scores of 800. If you're in the third quartile, meaning 50th to 75th percentile, so that means like you're above about 50% of people who are admitted. You can find all this information online by Googling the school. Take a look at the section scores, because if you have a 600 verbal and 800 math, well, engineering, that might be good. But if it's flipped and it's 600 math, 800 verbal, even though a 1400 is a nice score, you might not want to submit that, because they don't care about your verbal, it's engineering. They want to know that you've got near perfect in math. So not all 1400s are created equal. And you can't unsee a weak score. So this is just the dark side of it. A weak test score does become part of the conversation. You've now got options, so don't send it if you really aren't comfortable. You can always check if you're in the range or not. So just don't submit a super low test score. Don't send those if you have the choice. And then treat each school differently. So you can't, usually every list, like you're not going to be able to make the decision based on one list, every college the same. So maybe if it's a super competitive reach school, don't submit, but do it to your safety school. If you're applying on the Common App, but you don't want your score to a few of the schools sent to them, then don't put it on there on the Common App, just send it separately, right? These are the things we have to think about now in terms of how to approach. To submit, yes or no. Here's an example with Swarthmore, and you've got their middle 50 percentile ranges. So what that means is for verbal, if you're in the range of 680 to 750, that's the 25th to 75th percentile of students who got in the past year. For math, it's quite a bit higher, 700 plus, and the composite is 1380 to 1540. So if you had like a 1400, kind of a close call. If you have a 1500, slam dunk, you'll submit. And then 1450, probably yes, depending on some other factors. So like looking here, how do you stack up? Yeah, you can see 66% of freshmen that are in this current year's class are between 700, 800 on that. That's pretty amazing and competitive. So important to keep that in mind. General rule, bottom quartile, you don't submit. So under 1380, no. 25th to 50th percentile gray area, but most college counselors I think would tend towards probably no. 50th to 75th percentile submit usually, and then top quartile we're always going to submit. Right, so it makes sense. I mean, just kind of looking at where you're at compared to other applicants. And I mentioned this, but 2020 ranges might be skewed because of so many non-test submitters. So ranges went quite a bit up because the lower scoring students weren't submitting. So I would go maybe 3 years back to get a better sense, but it's hard to know. And some colleges are sticking with these higher score ranges. So like Tulane, which has become a better and better school, now a score that would have been competitive a few years ago might not be anymore. So they've really made some adjustments. You can see here the score ranges have shifted big time. Middle 50th percentile for Georgia, another school that just continues to get harder and harder to get into. I mean, that's pretty nuts. It went up 4 points for the middle 50th percentile. So instead of 27 to 32, now 31 to 34. I mean, that's pretty amazing. And who knows how long this will last. We could see BU, Boston University, same thing. Was 1360 to 1480, now 1430 to 1540 is your middle 50. So way more competitive among those who are submitting scores. And now it's like, is 34 no good for Penn? I mean, maybe not. It's pretty insane, but maybe not, because now the middle 50th percentile is like a perfect score. So a lot of IBs are like that now. And of course, I mean, that's a bit absurd. And at 34, there are plenty of people with 34 should get in, but the ranges are going up. Final kind of point there, you can see the average is up 38 or 35 points, depending on where you look. So from 2020, 1323 to 1361, I mean, that's a pretty significant leap. So again, middle 50th percentile ranges for most colleges have now gone up, which is another thing to consider. We've reached the end, which is good. Timing was nice. We got 5 minutes for questions. And so I guess first let me say, Applerouth's running our summer sale just for the next couple of days, ends at the end of June. You can get up to 2 free hours for 10 hours of test prep. And the way that tutoring works is you can do in person if you're in a city with Applerouth offices, or you can do online. I tutor all online. And happy to also, you can call, and we've got a great client services team that can offer you just insight or advice. You don't have to commit to anything. What I'd like to know is if there are any questions that I can answer in just a few minutes. If you are satisfied, feel free to dip out. And thank you for joining. But if there are any questions, I'll take a few. Whether it's about ACT, SAT stuff, college admissions, school reports, or anything like that. Just a couple minutes to see if you got any questions. So we got one question about the English sections. The difference in English, so ACT is called English. It's 75 questions in 45 minutes. And it's really, there's a lot of overlap between the two sections. So grammar and rhetoric on both. For SAT, it's 44 questions in 35 minutes. So it's shorter. It's the second section, it's called writing. But really, they almost have the exact same question types. So that's verb tense and punctuation and clauses and accomplish a task and connectors. They have the same exact question types. The ACT is easier and faster paced, 75 questions, 45 minutes. The SAT is more analytical, a little bit harder with data interpretation, and you get more time per question. Correct. Georgia students for public schools and most schools, it's required now to submit scores. So yes, if you're applying to like UGA, got to submit scores for the application, and they got to be good these days. What is the rest score for UW 3.93 GPA? Okay, so this is always a tough question. So look, 3.93 GPA, if someone has a 3.9 GPA is applying to UW, University of Washington, I'm assuming. I would just search online. They're going to give you the percentiles, 25th to 75th for last year. And I think that you can really rely on it. And ultimately, a 3.93 at most schools is a great score. So it can only help, but it's just one thing to consider. So I can't answer that definitively. I would say it's a nice GPA score that might allow you to submit a tiny bit lower test score, but I would just look at the quartiles and see. And looks like last question is, what's the maximum score for ACT? Nice, easy one to end. 36. So you can get a perfect 36 if you average the 4 scores and have a 35.5 or above. But ACT is out of 36, 4 section scores, all out of 36, averaged out. And SAT is out of 1600. I appreciate the questions. Appreciate you all joining. And that does it for this evening. Thank you guys so much and have a great rest of the day.